Again, my name is Kerry Sutton. Thanks, Steve. Steve and I are cohorts in ACI. We work on the codes and standards, advocacy, and outreach. I've been on board for just going on 5 years. Steve, I think 6. Thanks, Shamim, for giving that great overview of the code development process through the ICC, the iCodes process, as well as NFPA. These are the areas Steve and I work in. This is our life, and it's kind of interesting to see from your perspective all that process, because it is quite complex going through the model code development. But just to know, and has anybody in the room here ever been involved with any of these organizations in going forward with a proposal? So, Tricia, lucky you. But I think it goes to show, as structural engineers, civil engineers, material specialists, this is not what we learn when we're in school. We don't come out of graduate from our programs, from our master's and our PhD and other things saying, I'm going to be a code development engineer. It's something you kind of find your way into, and I think you become passionate about because you realize this is something, where we as engineers are doing work. We need to be involved with this process. We are the experts, right? We are developing these standards and these codes, and we need to be the ones out there advocating and doing the work to educate folks, because in this process, there's a lot of folks involved that are not engineers. We have code officials who are not always engineers. We have other people from industry that are coming in and looking at these standards from very different perspectives from us. And so as engineers, and especially ACI, because we do have several documents here that I'll talk about that we try to advocate for, it's important for us to be there, to be the voice. And as I get to the end of my presentation, I'll start to talk about how that's really important as members of ACI and our industry, as well as some of our other partners that we have out there. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of overview. I'm going to talk just briefly here about ACI's mission, because there is a mission for code advocacy within ACI. So we'll just a little bit on that, code advocacy and outreach. Dave Tepke mentioned there is actually a board level committee, codes and standards advocacy and outreach, which we meet at convention. We talk about things within ACI and recommendations that we can make to the board, things that we see that are important. And Dave is now the chair of that level committee here at ACI. I'm going to talk about state and local code adoption the process. So Shamim did a great job, and Dave alluded to a lot of the model code process, how we get our standards and codes in the model codes. But then there are those steps. How do we get it actually adopted and referenced and used so that the engineers on the ground, the code officials, have these documents available to them to use? And then I want to really talk a little bit too about opportunities for local code development and advocacy, because this is, since I came on board, Steve works a lot on these model code levels. I work with him, but I'm really working pretty specifically with many states and with some of our local stakeholders to where there's a need to reference ACI documents, where on a state level and a local level where the code is maybe a newer code or one of ACI codes that's not yet adopted in the model codes. So we'll talk about that, and then talk about some of the resources now that are available for our ACI members and our industry partners on how we work together to collaborate. You can see, Shamim is with NRMCA. We partner with them on many things within industry proposals in the model code, but there's a lot of other stakeholders that we can reach out to, not just within ACI, but outside our organization, that many of you may be familiar with or working with already, that we can collaborate with. So just some of the highlights of those things. So ACI does have a vision and a mission. Our vision, ACI envisions a future where everyone has the knowledge needed to use concrete effectively to meet the demands of a changing world. So this is our vision. This is actually, as of, I think, 2017-18, the new vision for ACI. But with that vision came this mission. ACI develops disseminates, and advances the adoption of its consensus-based knowledge in concrete and its uses. So actually that language in there is basically the forward movement to not only do we have these great committees that develop all this great knowledge, but we have to go out and let people and educate people on it and get it adopted in these model codes or in jurisdictions where there's need for our documents. So that's another step. It's very interesting for me to sit in, anybody in here on a code committee? Okay, a few people over here. So I love going in, sitting in on the meetings, all the work that's being done to develop your code. Tons of work, brilliant, ideas are going in, many hours of work, years of work on this. That code now needs to go somewhere, right? It needs to be adopted and referenced so it can be used. That's the next step. So a lot of times those code committees are always, they're obviously, focused on getting the updates of the codes or making sure that the right research is implemented in it, but getting that code actually adopted in a model code or referenced is that next step. So ACI has more than 400 technical documents. Dave kind of got into this. How is a code actually, or a standard actually, put into code? Well, there's a lot of things that go into that before that code is actually developed. And over time, you have guides, you have tech notes, you have things different committees are working on that eventually kind of go into what we could then move into a code. We have specifications, as Dave mentioned, reports and guides, references, annual manuals of practice, lots of documents that we work with. So on the level, we have about 32 codes. That might be up now, I think because our newest one just came on board, the ACI 323 low carbon concrete code. So, and the 9 is referencing the number of codes that are actually referenced in the model codes of ACI. So again, with 32 different types of codes from our different committees, and 9 that are now that are at the current time referenced in some of these model codes that we've been discussing. Specifications, over 40. A lot of times with the code, we'll have a specification that goes with that. Dave mentioned that. The code is directing the engineer, the design professional. The specification is directing the contractor. Reports and guides, hundreds of them. You've worked on them. You've all been part of doing that. And these are so essential to do further explanation of what the code or the specification is covering, or adding additional knowledge to what that will cover. A lot of reference documents and our manuals of practice that we have out there available for the design community. We have, it's a very exciting time in ACI right now. We have a lot of development of new codes that are happening. Some of you may be involved with, anybody involved with developing or on a newer code committee? Okay, so yeah, great. So a lot of work goes into that. And these are all brought forward at kind of the process that Dave described. An idea is out there or a need is out there and identified. The committee, is brought forth and that work starts. And the time frame for that varies very greatly, right? Depending on the committee and the information that's needed to develop that code. But these are some of the ones we have right now that are in process. Actually, couple joint committees, ACI and PCI and PTI have their codes 319 and 320, which I believe are still in final comments. I don't think they're published yet. Anybody in here on any of those committees? But they are almost done. They are pretty much at the end of their process. Obviously many years of hard work on that and collaboration between the two different groups, PCI and ACI and PTI and ACI. So those will be referenced, I believe, in the 318-25 edition. So again, the 318, the next edition, 25, which is supposed to be ready here at the end of the year for publication, will then begin referencing some of these newer codes that have been in develop over the last couple years. 321, durability code. 322, we have a code committee right now developing the concrete pool and water shape code. Anybody here on that one? That's been around, just started a couple years ago, I believe. There was a need. There was a need for design guidance for this particular concrete product. So that committee formed a few years ago, and they're probably a good couple years away from developing a final code, which will eventually and hopefully be, we will work to have it referenced in the ISPC model code. But again, a little bit different time frame for that, but just you can see here the variety and a lot of different types of areas where ACI is working to develop some of the new codes and standards. Also here just to mention our ITG 12 code requirements, construction of additively constructed walls or 3D printing, which we will look, the results of that will be something that we will look at having referenced in the International Residential Code. So this will be for residential applications. So a lot going on. This is a lot of work, and this is, you know, above and beyond already many of the hundreds of committees that we already have going. But you know, as our technology is changing, as things change, and Dave gave that great slide of, you know, back in history we had, you know, 318 was pretty much there, but you can see over time as the expertise and is being gathered, and it's really being pushed out there by the engineers doing the design and work, that these new codes are being developed and these new standards are being developed. So lots of activity and lots of opportunities to be involved, right? On another note too, because we do, when I'm out there working with states on adoption, and even on the model codes, we're always looking at, ACI has certification programs. Anybody know how many certifications that ACI has? You know how many? 30 plus around. Every time I ask, there's like and there's several new ones that are being looked at this point too. So a lot of times, like in some of our codes, we'll reference a certain certification that has been put in place as far as inspection or testing. Like 318 obviously corresponds with a lot of the testing requirements that we have with some of our certification programs for field testing technician and some of these other ones. But we have many that have been developed that kind of coordinate and work with those codes and standards, and a few new ones in the work. I believe there's one inspection program at, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, on the GFRP reinforcement inspection. I think that's under development right too. So that will kind of tag in with that new 44011 code for some inspection requirement, certification requirements. So ACI, again, we have our mission and our statement for code advocacy. A couple other things, and many other organizations do this, have a position statement. So these are actually statements that you can find on our website that were brought forward to our board and our board signed off on. And this is basically shows ACI as an organization, and many other organizations like ours or associations do this, what our position is on how our organization and our members move forward within our organization. So we have position statements available for current codes. Basically, the statement will say something, you know, to the effect of ACI wants to make sure our standards are current and up to date, and we do that as committee members. We're always, you know, trying to update and bring the most recent information in. We have position statements within ACI, our organization, on certification programs. We want to do the same there, on sustainability, on adoption of new standards, on ACI chapter and the involvement. So if any of you are involved in a chapter level, there's a position statement for how the board in ACI agrees or looks at how our chapters can work together with us to advance things. Workforce development, public good, carbon neutral concrete. Engineering curricula is basically just our position on how we want to work within our education community to make sure they have information from ACI that's most up to date and coordinated. And I don't think we have any others right now in the works, but these are guiding principles that you can find within the ACI website. We have some strategies. So Steve and I work together again to, you know, we are the codes and advocacy engineers, but we also put together some strategy that we recommend within the organization. So really what we're looking at here is we want to make sure that ACI standards are referenced in the model codes. So the process that Shamim went through, we want to make sure our standards or any new standards get referenced so that they can be adopted those model codes can then be adopted within jurisdictions. We want to remove or look at removing provisions from the building codes already addressed in ACI standards. So we didn't really hit on this, but a lot of times you can see, Shamim put up examples of some of the language in the I codes as well as in NFPA, but sometimes there are other organizations outside of ACI that come in and language gets changed, which then may contradict what ACI standard has in there. So we need to go in and look to make sure that what we have referenced is still aligning with the code that's there. So that's something we're always looking out for when we're going through a model code cycle, is looking at what the provisions are that make sure that ACI standards are still being properly addressed in the standard. We want to make sure that those references are current in those model codes. Shamim mentioned this, that whole cycle, one of the first things in the cycle we do as code advocacy or code engineers is look at, are the proper ACI standard, the right year being referenced within that. And that's something that we definitely want to make sure is done. We want the most current standard reference. And we want to update an existing and development of new standards. And we do this through collaboration. The example of the presenters before me, gave that. We do it, Steve and I do this. This is part of our work here within ACI, but it takes many other groups that we have to collaborate. There's other industry partners that we work with, and we're all doing this for the good of the industry, right? We want concrete to have the standards in place so that the practitioners can use it in the proper way. Again, just pointing out here, Steve and I really work on these things all the time. This is what we do, and these other two items here highlighted, these are really things within the industry, within partners that we then reach out to get additional help with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Steve he's been the moderator here. He's going to do a little talk to wrap up here in a few minutes. This is our team from ACI, just, we're the ones, if there's an issue or a concern about model code development, we get involved. We alluded to Shamim Rashid Rasad. She is our president for the Alliance for Concrete Codes and Standards. This is an organization that ACI is a part of, but all these other organizations. So if you're involved with any of these other organizations, know you have a representative who's involved with this voluntary committee. And basically we meet a couple times a year, especially now during the model code cycle, to talk about proposals that we can collaborate on, support each other on. We don't always have the same view on some of the proposals, but we at least make each other aware of what we're going to be doing. ACI has specific needs that we're looking at, and our MCA might have specific needs. But we try to collaborate. So know that this is happening if you work with any of these other organizations. And then frequently we also work with and pull in, when we're looking at code development and standards, other organizations, NCSEA, so Structural Engineers Association. Many times when ACI is bringing forward proposals, we also want to make sure our friends and partners with NCSEA, Structural Engineers Association, are also in line and understanding what we're trying to do. So know that we do collaborate, and we are in contact and meet and discuss these proposals with those folks as well. SEI and AIA as well. So on one of our codes, our repair code, a real group that we hadn't really reached out to a lot in the past was AIA, the architects. They are in the code realm as well, and they are deeply involved, and they have different view and look at things than the structural engineers, but many times we have to think about pulling them in when we're looking at these proposals and changes on a national level as well. So that is happening. Shamim went into a lot of this. I'm not going to go more into this, but again, for ACI, the model codes that we generally work our documents fit into are the International Code Council, or the I codes. We have references for our documents in the International Building Code, obviously, our 318 code, that's where that sits. The International Residential Code, where the ACI's residential code sits. Newly in the International Existing Building Code, our 562 repair code sits now. International Energy Conservation Code and the International Green Construction Code are two areas which traditionally ACI has not worked in these areas, but because of some of the codes that we are now looking at and developing, Shamim pointed out the ACI TMS codes that you are putting in proposals for NFPA will also be looked at going into the International Energy Code. So this is a different area, different kind of group, different stakeholders for ACI. But as we are developing some of these newer codes, they don't always fit into the traditional model where we're going, which is, it's not a bad thing. It just means more education, more collaboration, kind of going into these new realms. And then NFPA, ACI has several codes that are referenced in the NFPA. We have our 318 code, our 562 code is now referenced. Hopefully we'll get these ACI TMS documents referenced. And then a 376 code for containment and structures for liquefied refrigerated gas. That's a code, 376. Anybody here from that committee? So that is also referenced within NFPA 59A. So just a couple of the main areas really where ACI and many of our partners really bring our codes and standards into for use for the practitioners. Shamim did a great job outlining this process. I'm going to say just in a few words, it's a 3-year process, the model code development, whether you're in NFPA, depending on what committee you're on, or on the ICOs, the ICC process, generally a 3-year process. We're pretty much busy looking at proposals and you know, even though it's a 3-year cycle, you're constantly working for the next cycle. So right now, all of this that Shamim brought up and many of the proposals that are out there are for the 2027 code, the 2027. So 3 years in advance. Back in January, the proposals were due for the Group A. The proposals for Group B, which will be where ACI has many of our proposals, will start in January, and then another 1.5 to 2 years before that cycle's done. The big picture is, you know, 2027, it'll be, you know, 2024 is literally just been done. You know, that came out in December. Many of the IBC came out in December 2024. There was a delay in the energy code and the residential code, which didn't come out until it was like February or March. So there's always this delay. We're always a little bit behind. And when I show you some of the slides on state adoption, it even is compounded more because it'll get more complex. But know that this process is on a regular cycle for the model code development, and we really, there's no break. We're always moving forward. There's always something that needs to be done, and then it starts again, right? So, that kind of showed it a little bit on the timing. So, but Shamim did a great job. That's hard to do because they're very complex. There's a lot of, and the ICC changed now, so there's like more hearings now and more opportunities to bring proposals. So here's a little bit on adoption I wanted to share, and this is in the US, obviously, statewide codes for commercial buildings. So this is the IBC, obviously, which our 318 documents referenced in, as well as a couple other of our standards and some of our certifications. But this kind of gives you the complexity of the idea here in Dave alluded to as, you know, mandatory versus permissive codes. So the model codes are developed, right? And then the jurisdictions, the states, at least here in the United States, have to be adopted. So each of those states then have different requirements of how they adopt the building code. Some states make it mandatory, and these are legislated, generally, legislated. So, for example, in purple, these are states identified as having mandatory adoption of the International Building Code. So they're on regular cycles, and when they adopt and update their standards, it's mandatory for jurisdictions within that state. Michigan's an example I can show. It's in their legislation, the state adopts it, and the local jurisdictions have to, within a certain amount of time, adopt the IBC, the one that's being adopted statewide. So many of the states kind of follow that, and it's in their legislation to do that. So then the local jurisdictions fall in line, adopt it locally within the cities and in the local jurisdictions, and they enforce it as well. They enforce that code, right? But there are other states out there where some of these codes are brought in, and they're permissive. The jurisdictions don't necessarily have to adopt it. This is kind of true a little bit for some of the international existing building codes. A couple of the states, they don't require it. It's not mandatory that the jurisdictions adopt the International Building Code. It's permissive, meaning it can be used, but it's not mandatory. Then you have these states, the white ones, kind of the wild ones, they have no requirements within the state for adoption. So what happens there, and I'll show it I think in the next slide, is you get cities, major metropolitan areas who have authorities having jurisdiction, who begin to then, within ordinances, require certain codes and standards to be adopted, and certain years you can see here. So, for example, Texas being one of those states, you can see Houston and Dallas being major metropolitan areas. They kind of, on their own, within their ordinances, require the IBC to be adopted, right? And they can adopt right now. Dallas is on the 2021 IBC. The 2024 just came out, so they're probably looking at adopting that. But then you have a town like Lubbock, who's still on the 2015. Or 5 more minutes, okay. All right, I gotta move through. So this is just an example of the complexity of, we get the code out there, we get it in the model code, then these jurisdictions have to adopt it. And they're kind of all over the board. Many of them are on 3-year cycles, some are on 6. So they don't adopt or update their codes for 6 years. So, and then many, like the 2024 codes are now out there. Many of these states are just starting to look at the 2024 codes. Many of them have just finished adopting the 2021 codes, as you know. So a lot of different variety on that. So just to kind of end here, to talk a little bit about that complexity and how we can work to assist states and local jurisdiction with advocacy and knowing about our documents. We really have to think locally. So ACI, we have local chapters, we have a lot of organizations that work locally in the state, but when it comes down to states adopting, Steve and I can go into a state and say, we're here from ACI, we have a great new code, we want you to adopt it, but really it needs to be championed by needs within a state, right? So we've kind of set up this framework within ACI now, where we look and see opportunities in different states and jurisdictions where there might be a need for a certain specific code that's out there that might not be in the model code yet, and how we work with local folks to get that done. So state code adoption, you saw the model for ICC and the model codes. State adoption is very similar to that, but not always, right? So each state then has their own model for adopting codes and standards. Some have very elaborate, very open process. Others, not so much. Like you go on their website to try to find out when the state of X, like Kentucky, how often they update their codes. It's kind of difficult to even find on their website how often that process. Whereas other states like California, they're on 3-year and they have interim cycles. They adopt every year and a half on some of they're always in a cycle to adopt the most updated standards. They're very progressive, right? So the main thing here with this slide is every state, every jurisdiction is different, right? Even the city of New York, they're on a model code development cycle. Very different probably from the state, but each jurisdiction can make that distinction and do that. So to actually focus in a little bit on how ACI supports this effort, when I came on board, the first thing we wanted to do is kind of set up these groups. As we work in different states, and now we've been working, you can see here, in 18 different states, meaning for whatever reason, we've reached out to our chapter or supporters in several different states to let them know of opportunities for code adoption within their state. Some of them we've gotten more involved with and helped them and have had some successes, and I'll show you that. In others, it's more just exploratory, like, do you know where your state is at? Do you know what the process is and if you can get involved? So we do have these collaboration groups, and they are on our website. We also have an international collaboration group on here. I know some of you folks might be international and wonder, how does this work on an international level? So we have 50 states here with different ways of adopting. I'm sure all of the countries now have different, so it's a lot. So Steve and I are two people, which means advocacy is local. And I'm just kind of leave it at that, and I think you all will understand that. But know that ACI is in a position, because we want to advance the adoption of our codes, not only here, but also internationally. And I think there'll probably be more work being done in that arena in the future, because we see that there's a great need for it. Just a quick example here. In North Carolina, before our ACI 562 repair code is now in the 2024 IEBC model code, which is great. That's where we want it, because now all jurisdictions who adopt that code can use it. But many times we have a code that we have developed, and it's not in the model code yet. And this was the case for ACI 562. That code was actually put in publication in 2012. It's been out there for a while. But getting it adopted in the model code was difficult for many different reasons. We had a lot of stakeholders that always commented and kind of were in opposition or wanted to see things differently. So the committee would go back and work and make that document now to where in the last cycle we finally were able to get consensus and agreement to get that document. That's probably a longer process. So anyway, so that is an example of one of our codes where what we did is looked at a need in a particular state that was going through updating their model codes, and we reached out to stakeholders within North Carolina, including our ACI chapter members who do work there. We also collaborated with the International Concrete Repair Institute, some of their members in North Carolina. Is there a need for this code in the state of North Carolina? And they were like, yes, we want to take a proposal forward in the state to get ACI 562 reference. We feel a need. And this is really local driven. Contractors and engineers within the state of North Carolina that felt getting this code adopt in the state was important. We also had support from our Ready Mix Association, the local chapter, again, ICRA. And these are just some of the people that were involved with actually either helping to write letters of support. Some of these folks, like Dave Tepke, who's in our ACI Carolinas chapter, came and testified in front of the North Carolina Building Commission on the proposal. But really, that grassroots level for code advocacy and code development on state level is very local. So that's kind of a plea that when we do this, and we can, and if there are states and other jurisdictions we can do this in, it really has to be a collaboration effort locally as well. We had many other industry supporters also that helped with this effort. So in summary, we did get it in. So ACI 562 is referenced as an amendment to the North Carolina existing building code. And that went into effect in 2022, because this happened a few years back now. And I think it was a good experience for ACI to be there and to do this and to help support the industry there. It also, when you're doing this, you're also advocating for ACI. We're now in front of building officials and people in the state that now see ACI as a leader in this area, right? So that collaboration, that credibility is developed as we work with some of these jurisdictions. I'm just going to kind of move through here because I know my timing's a little bit coming up here. Another example, working in the state of Ohio. We have our ACI 44011 code that is now referenced in the 2024 I-codes, but a few years back, we brought forward some proposals in Ohio with the help and support of our ACI chapter in Ohio. Some of the members here on that team that were there, we brought proposals forward, met with the commission. We had some people speak in support of it and educated those folks on that and moved forward, and they are now referenced as amendments to the Ohio Building Code. I'm just going to move there. So just to kind of wrap this up, on a state level and with local jurisdictions, really a lot of it has to do with finding out locally where your jurisdiction's at in updating its codes. As well as on the model codes, some of the states are every 3 years, some are 6 years, many of them are legislated to do it so often, and then developing those relationships. These folks really rely on experts in the field, so we need to be there if you're working in these states or communities to be the experts, right? Proposal development, we work with our stakeholders on that. Testifying, again, we have our members locally help to do that, where you can get involved. And then in general, ACI, we want advocacy, our industry partners as a resource. We want to educate folks. Can't emphasize this enough. We have standards coming out. We have standards that are being updated. We have spent a lot of work within our group and our committee here, but educating a lot of those folks out there using it, including the building officials. They need to understand what changes were made and what we've done to update and make the codes better. Structural engineers, architects, and contractors. So we need to educate, our own members, but there are many others.